The cream-colored envelope rested in the center of the polished dining table, placed there with such deliberate care that every conversation in the room faded into silence. No one reached for it. No one even looked away. The atmosphere changed in an instant, as though the weight of that single envelope had settled over everyone present. "I think you should read this before we go any further," Adrian said calmly. His voice carried a confidence that sounded rehearsed. The kind people use when they're certain the evening will end exactly as they planned. I studied the envelope without touching it. Across the table, Daniel avoided my eyes. His attention remained fixed on his untouched dinner, while his mother, Helen, wrapped both hands around her wineglass as though it were keeping her steady. Business negotiations had taught me to recognize silence. I've watched billion-dollar deals collapse because someone hesitated for half a second too long. But this wasn't a boardroom. There were no attorneys, no contracts, and no shareholders, just an envelope, and three people convinced they had walked into this dinner with the upper hand. Instead of reaching for it, I rested my hand lightly on my water glass. "Before I open it," I said evenly, "perhaps you'd like to explain what you believe is inside." Adrian smiled. "We simply want to settle something from the past." The past. Interesting how people always speak about it as though they witnessed every moment themselves. I nodded without agreeing or disagreeing. Most people misunderstand power. They imagine tailored suits, luxury cars, towering offices wrapped in glass. They never picture an older man wearing a faded work shirt, driving an aging pickup truck, spending his mornings tending vegetables before answering emails worth millions. Appearances are useful. They encourage people to underestimate you. "I'm in no hurry," I replied. The smile on Adrian's face weakened ever so slightly. Only for a moment. But moments like that reveal everything. He believed tonight belonged to him. He didn't realize he had entered mine. I ignored the envelope. Not because I feared whatever was inside, but because experience had taught me that papers rarely tell an entire story. They tell the version someone wants preserved. "I'll read it later," I said. Daniel finally looked at me before quickly glancing back toward his father. That brief movement spoke volumes. He wasn't comfortable. More importantly, he didn't understand why we were really there. "Good." Adrian cleared his throat. "Marcus, this doesn't have to become difficult. We're only asking for fairness." Fairness. I've heard that word countless times throughout my career. Usually from people arriving after the decisions have already been made. "I'm always willing to discuss fairness," I answered. "I simply prefer knowing all the rules before agreeing to the game." Leaning back, I noticed Helen glance once again at my worn shirt before quickly looking away. They had judged me the instant I entered the restaurant. That was their first mistake. The second was believing Daniel connected our worlds. The truth was far more complicated. Long before Daniel ever met my daughter, I knew exactly who he was. Not casually, completely. His academic record, his previous employers, the pressure tests during interviews, even how he treated junior employees when he believed nobody important was watching. Some people call it excessive caution. As a father, I called it responsibility. "So," I asked casually, "where are you working these days?" Daniel answered immediately. "Stonebridge Holdings." I nodded thoughtfully. "Solid company." Adrian smiled proudly. "They recruited him from hundreds of candidates." "I'm sure they did." The conversation paused. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Something about my response had unsettled him. "Good. Have you enjoyed your first year?" I asked. "I have," he replied. "We've reorganized several regional operations and significantly improved efficiency." "By how much?" He hesitated before answering. "Just over $4 million in annual savings." I smiled faintly. I imagine the owners appreciated that. "They certainly did," Adrian answered before Daniel could speak. I simply nodded. What none of them knew was that I had approved every recommendation Daniel submitted during those 14 months. Not personally. Quietly. Every report eventually reached my desk. Every promotion required my signature. Every opportunity he'd received existed because I had allowed it. And Daniel never knew. That detail mattered more than anything else happening tonight. Adrian tapped the envelope once again. "We're getting distracted." "No," I replied calmly. "We're finally approaching the important part." Silence returned. This time it felt heavier. The waiter cleared empty plates before disappearing as though sensing he didn't belong in whatever was unfolding. Daniel glanced between his parents and me. Questions were beginning to form behind his eyes. Questions nobody else at the table was prepared to answer. I finally reached toward the envelope, not because Adrian wanted me to, because I had decided the timing belonged to me. I lifted it slowly, turned it over once in my hands, and broke the seal. Inside waited several neatly organized documents. The first page revealed a single name, Leon Mercer. The moment I saw it, memories I had buried years earlier came rushing back, not with surprise, but with recognition. I placed the papers gently on the table without saying a word. Then I looked directly at Adrian. "So," I said quietly, "tell me your version of what happened." Adrian folded his hands together, studying me as though he had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. The confidence in his expression suggested he believed the truth had already been decided. All he had to do was tell it. "My brother, Leon Mercer," he began, "spent 20 years building a successful company. Then you came along." Daniel slowly lifted his eyes toward me. "He trusted you," Adrian continued. "He treated you like family, and you repaid that trust by forcing him out of the business he helped create." Helen remained silent, though her grip tightened around the stem of her glass. "You took everything from him," Adrian said. "The company, his savings, his reputation. By the time he died, he had nothing left." The words settled across the table, heavy, accusing, designed to provoke. I looked down at the documents before meeting Adrian's gaze again. "Is that everything?" I asked quietly. He frowned. "Isn't it enough?" "No." The single word hung in the air. "It isn't." Daniel shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. His father expected anger. Instead, he received calm. "People often mistake silence for weakness. In reality, silence gives truth room to breathe." "I've heard stories like yours before," I said. "They're persuasive because they leave out the parts that don't fit." Adrian leaned forward. "So you're denying it?" "I'm saying you've inherited a version of events." His jaw tightened. "My brother never lied. I never said he did." The distinction mattered. A person doesn't always lie by inventing facts. Sometimes they simply remove the inconvenient ones. Daniel finally spoke. His question wasn't directed toward either side. He genuinely wanted to understand. I appreciated that. "Leon and I founded the company together," I said. Adrian immediately shook his head. "You invested later." "No," I held his gaze. "We started with borrowed money, a rented warehouse, and equipment that barely functioned." Daniel listened carefully. "For the first several years," I continued, "everything went well. We worked impossible hours, signed new clients, and slowly built something worth protecting." I paused. Then the numbers stopped making sense. Helen glanced toward Adrian, neither interrupted. Payments disappeared. Vendor invoices didn't match. Accounts were being moved without authorization. Daniel frowned. "You discovered someone was stealing?" "Eventually." "Who?" I looked directly at Adrian. "Your brother." The room fell silent. Adrian laughed once, a short, disbelieving laugh. "That's absurd. I wish it had been." I continued before anyone could interrupt. "I spent nearly 6 months reviewing financial records after everyone else had gone home. Every transfer, every contract, every signature. The evidence pointed to only one person." Daniel leaned forward. "Did you confront him?" "I did. What happened? I gave him a choice." Adrian scoffed. "You threatened him. I offered him accountability. There is a difference." Helen finally found her voice. "What kind of choice?" "He could repay what remained, resign peacefully, and avoid criminal charges." Adrian slammed his hand softly against the table. "You're rewriting history." "No, I'm remembering it." Another silence settled between us. This one felt different, not hostile, uncertain. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the papers his father had brought, then back to me. "If that's true," he asked carefully, "why didn't anyone ever hear your side?" I smiled faintly. "Because I never cared about winning public arguments. People believe whatever helps them sleep at night. My responsibility was protecting the company, not defending myself." Adrian shook his head again. "My brother said you destroyed him. I didn't. His decisions did." The waiter appeared briefly, asking whether anyone wanted coffee. 4 quiet voices answered no. The man disappeared without another word. Daniel rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. There has to be proof. There is. Adrian folded his arms. You expect us to believe you kept evidence for all these years. I didn't keep it. I preserved it. There is a difference. Without another word, I reached inside my jacket. This time I removed a dark blue envelope, smaller, older. Its edges had softened with age. I placed it beside Adrian's documents. No dramatic gesture, no announcement, just quiet certainty. What is that? Daniel asked. The complete financial investigation, original bank records, independent audit reports, signed statements, and handwritten letters from Leon himself. Adrian stared at the envelope but made no attempt to touch it. His confidence had begun to crack only slightly. Enough for me to notice. He admitted everything? Daniel asked. Privately, he knew the evidence couldn't be disputed. Helen looked toward her husband. You never mentioned any of this. Adrian remained silent. For the first time that evening, he no longer looked certain. He looked conflicted. I gently pushed the blue envelope toward him. You don't have to believe me. You only have to read. The room became perfectly still. Outside the restaurant windows, city lights reflected across the glass, but no one noticed. Every eye remained fixed on the envelope resting between us. Adrian slowly reached forward. His fingers stopped just short of touching it. The confidence he had carried into dinner was fading with every passing second, because somewhere deep inside, he was beginning to wonder if the story he'd believed for years had never been the whole story at all. Adrian stared at the blue envelope for several long seconds before finally picking it up. His movements lacked the certainty he had shown earlier. The confidence that had filled the room when dinner began had quietly slipped away. Without speaking, he opened the envelope. Inside were neatly organized copies of financial records, audit reports, and handwritten correspondence. Every document had been dated, signed, and arranged in chronological order. He read the first page, then the second. His expression changed with every sheet he turned. Daniel watched his father instead of the documents. He wasn't looking for evidence anymore. He was looking for answers. Helen leaned closer. What does it say? She asked softly. Adrian didn't answer. He continued reading until a folded letter slipped onto the table. His hand froze. What is that? Daniel asked. I recognized it immediately. It was written by Leon. Adrian unfolded the page carefully. His eyes moved across the handwriting before he quietly began reading. I made choices that cannot be undone. Marcus gave me an opportunity to fix what I had broken, but I couldn't accept the consequences. If anyone ever reads this, know that my mistakes were my own. The room fell completely silent. Daniel looked at his father. Is that really Uncle Leon's handwriting? Adrian compared the letter to another signature on one of the documents. After several seconds, he slowly nodded. Yes. No one spoke. The silence no longer felt tense. It felt heavy, the kind that follows the collapse of something people have believed for years. I never saw this, Adrian admitted quietly. You weren't supposed to, I replied. I kept it private because exposing your brother publicly would have hurt innocent people more than it helped anyone. Helen looked confused. You never filed criminal charges? No, why not? Because there were families depending on that company. Employees who had mortgages. People raising children. If the scandal became public, hundreds of people would have paid for one man's mistakes. Daniel looked at me differently now. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. You let him leave? I did. And he never came back? He chose not to. Adrian lowered the letter. He told us you forced him into bankruptcy. I never forced him. He walked away after refusing every opportunity to repair the damage. The words weren't spoken with anger, only honesty. Daniel rested both elbows on the table. I've worked at Stonebridge for over a year. You've questioned every report I've submitted. You've challenged my recommendations. You've rejected some of my proposals. I smiled. Yes, why? Because that's my responsibility. Daniel frowned. You knew who I was from the beginning. I did. You still hired me. I approved your hiring. But I never hired you because you were dating my daughter. I hired you because you earned the position. His eyes widened slightly. So every interview was real? Every assessment real? My promotions? Earned. Daniel leaned back, letting the realization settle. So none of it was a favor, no. I never believed favors build capable leaders. Helen finally spoke. Then why keep your identity hidden? I answered without hesitation. Because titles change how people behave. If Daniel knew I owned the company, every conversation would have been influenced by that knowledge. I wanted to know who he was when he believed no one important was watching. Daniel lowered his eyes. And what did you learn? I considered the question carefully. You admit mistakes. You listen before speaking. You respect people below your position. And when you disagree, you explain why instead of raising your voice. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face. You noticed all that? I notice everything. He laughed quietly. I suppose I should have expected that. For the first time all evening, the tension eased. Even Helen smiled. Adrian remained silent. His attention stayed fixed on Leon's letter. I spent 4 years angry, he said at last. I blamed you for everything. I know. You knew? I understood why. Adrian looked up. You never tried to correct me. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was protecting the truth. He slowly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. I'm sorry. The words came quietly, without pride, without excuses, simply spoken. I judged you before I ever met you. You believed someone you loved. I don't blame you for that. Daniel looked between us. So this dinner was never about business. No, it was about unfinished history. I nodded, and history has a habit of returning when people least expect it. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the restaurant windows. The dining room had grown quieter as other guests finished their meals and departed. Our table remained occupied, not because anyone wanted to continue arguing, because everyone was trying to understand how one evening had changed years of assumptions. Daniel finally looked directly at me. There is one question I still need answered. I folded my hands together. Go ahead. He took a slow breath. If you approved my hiring and watched my work for 14 months, he paused. Why did you finally agree to meet my parents tonight? The answer had been waiting since the moment I accepted his invitation. And now, it was finally time to tell him. Daniel's question lingered between us. If you've known about me from the beginning, he asked, why agree to this dinner? Why now? I folded my hands on the table before answering. Because every decision has its proper time. He waited patiently. When you first started at Stonebridge Holdings, you were still proving yourself. I wasn't interested in judging you after a few months. Character isn't measured during easy days. It's revealed under pressure. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. So you were watching, I was observing. There is a difference, he smiled faintly. I suppose there is. For 14 months, I continued, I received reports about your work, not because I requested special treatment, but because every executive report eventually reached my office. You challenged your supervisors when necessary. You admitted mistakes instead of hiding them. And when one of your projects failed during the second quarter, you accepted responsibility instead of blaming your team. Daniel looked surprised. You knew about that? I approved the recovery plan. He let out a quiet laugh. I never imagined the owner was reading my reports. Most employees never think about who reads the final page. Helen looked at me with genuine curiosity. Did your daughter know? No, not even she knew. I wanted her relationship to develop naturally. Adrian looked up from the blue envelope. So neither of them realized who you really were. Correct, for the same reason. If people know who holds authority, they often become someone else. Daniel slowly nodded. I've seen that happen. So have I. The waiter approached to clear the remaining dishes. He glanced around the unusually quiet table before politely asking if anyone wanted dessert. Daniel looked at me. I think we all need a few more minutes. The waiter smiled politely and walked away. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt reflective. Adrian finally broke it. I owe you another apology. You don't owe me anything. I do. He straightened in his chair. I walked into this restaurant convinced I was defending my brother's memory. I believed every word he told us. I spent years resenting someone I had never bothered to understand. His voice carried regret instead of anger. I should have searched for the truth before judging you. I nodded. Most people don't. They inherit opinions. They rarely question them. Helen looked down at her hands. I'll admit something. We all turned toward her. When you arrived tonight, I judged you immediately. She gave a small, embarrassed smile. I noticed your old truck outside, your faded shirt. I assumed Daniel had chosen someone ordinary. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable. Helen, she gently raised a hand. No, I should say it. She faced me again. I confused appearance with success. I was wrong. I smiled politely. It happens more often than you might think. The people who need recognition usually display it. The people who already have it rarely do, Daniel chuckled. That explains your office. Adrian frowned. What office? Daniel laughed again. The executive suite. I visited it twice for meetings. It's surprisingly simple. No expensive artwork. No oversized desk, just books, family photographs, and paperwork. I smiled. I've never believed furniture makes better decisions. Even Adrian laughed quietly. The tension that had dominated the evening had almost completely disappeared. Daniel looked at me again. There's still something I don't understand. What is it? You already knew I cared about your daughter. I did. You knew I worked for your company. Yes, so why never tell me? I answered honestly. Because I wanted you to choose her without thinking about my influence. And I wanted her to choose you for the same reason. If either of you had known who I was, every decision afterward would have carried doubt. Daniel reflected on that for a moment. I think I understand. I hoped you would. He smiled. You were testing both of us. I wasn't testing. I was waiting. Waiting for what? For enough time to reveal who people truly are. Daniel extended his hand across the table. I appreciate that now. I shook it firmly. You earned my respect long before tonight. His expression softened. That means more than you realize. Adrian watched the exchange before quietly asking, will this change anything between us? I looked around the table. It already has. You came here expecting confrontation. Instead, we found understanding. He nodded slowly. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, nor should you. But truth gives people somewhere honest to begin. The waiter returned once more. This time, he said with a warm smile, may I finally bring dessert? Daniel looked around the table. For the first time that evening, everyone smiled. Yes, he replied. I think we've earned it. As the waiter disappeared toward the kitchen, rain continued falling beyond the restaurant windows. The storm outside had grown stronger. Inside, however, something entirely different had settled over the table. Not victory, not defeat. Simply peace. Yet one final truth remained unspoken. A truth that would change Daniel's understanding of the future, just as profoundly as everything he'd learned about the past. The desserts arrived a few minutes later, but no one seemed eager to touch them. The evening had begun as a confrontation, transformed into a conversation, and ended with something none of us had expected. Clarity. For the first time since we sat down, the weight in the room had disappeared. Daniel broke the silence. I've spent the last 14 months believing I understood my career, he said with a quiet smile. Tonight I've realized I only understood a small part of it. You understood the part that mattered most, I replied. He looked puzzled. The work. Everything else was background. He considered that for a moment before nodding. I suppose you're right. Adrian folded the blue envelope carefully and slid it back across the table. I don't think these belong with me. They're yours, I answered. He looked surprised. Why would you give them to me? Because the truth shouldn't stay locked away. You deserve to know the full story of your brother's life, not only the version he left behind. Adrian rested his hand on the envelope. I don't know if reading it again will be easy. It won't, but difficult truths are still better than comfortable illusions. He slowly nodded. I understand that now. Helen looked toward me with genuine warmth. I misjudged you the moment we met. I've been thinking about that all evening. I smiled, politely. We all judge people. The important thing is whether we're willing to change our opinion after learning more. She laughed softly. I certainly have. Daniel glanced between us before asking the question that had clearly been on his mind. So, where do we go from here? I leaned back comfortably. We move forward, no resentment, no revenge. The past has already taken enough from everyone. Adrian looked thoughtful. I spent years teaching myself to hate someone who wasn't responsible for my family's pain. You were grieving, I said. Grief often looks for someone to blame. He lowered his eyes. I wish Leon had trusted us with the truth. So do I, but every person has to live with the choices they make. Silence settled again, though this time it felt peaceful. Daniel finally picked up his spoon and laughed. I think our desserts are melting. Helen smiled. Probably because none of us remembered they were here. The laughter that followed was quiet but genuine. It felt natural, as though the evening had finally returned to what it should have been from the beginning. A family dinner. After a few moments, Daniel turned serious once more. I need to ask one last question. Go ahead. When you first learned I was dating your daughter, what was your biggest concern? I answered honestly, that she would someday trust the wrong person. And when did that concern disappear? The day I received a report from one of your department managers. Daniel frowned. What report? It wasn't about profits. It wasn't about performance. It described how you stayed late to help a junior employee fix a mistake. You never mentioned your title. You never asked for recognition. You simply helped. Daniel smiled, remembering. I barely recall that. I do. Moments like those reveal character better than achievements ever can. Helen looked proudly at her son. I've always hoped he'd become that kind of man. He already has. Daniel looked genuinely humbled. Thank you. I shook my head. You earned that respect yourself. The restaurant had nearly emptied by the time we stood. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining beneath the city lights. We walked together toward the entrance. Adrian paused beside me before we stepped outside. I don't expect us to become close friends overnight, he said. Neither do I, but perhaps we can stop being strangers. I extended my hand. I'd like that. He shook it firmly, not as an opponent, not as a man seeking answers, simply as someone ready to leave the past behind. Helen smiled before following him toward their car. Daniel remained beside me for a moment. You know, he said with a grin, Monday at work is going to feel very different. I laughed quietly. Only if you let it. So you're still planning to question my reports? Absolutely. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. We walked to our vehicles together. Before getting into his car, Daniel looked back. I'm glad you came tonight. Ah, so am I, he nodded once. See you Monday. See you Monday. As I drove home, the events of the evening replayed in my mind. People often believe strength comes from proving someone wrong. Experience has taught me something different. Real strength comes from remaining calm when others expect anger. Real success isn't measured by wealth, influence, or titles. It's measured by the respect you earn when no one knows who you are. The truth has a remarkable quality. It doesn't need louder voices. It doesn't need perfect timing. It simply waits. And sooner or later, no matter how many years pass, it always finds its way into the light.